As I sit here, reflecting on everything that happened, I realize that betrayal can shake you to your core. It can make you question yourself, your choices, and even your worth. But it doesn't have to define your life. What matters is how you respond. Do you allow deceit to control your emotions? Or do you reclaim your power calmly, deliberately, and with dignity? I chose to observe, gather evidence, and act with integrity. I set boundaries, protected my home and my marriage, and refused to be manipulated. I reclaimed not just a house, but my peace, my self-respect, and my clarity. And in doing so, I found that healing is possible, even after betrayal cuts deeply. I want to leave you with this thought. Betrayal isn't a measure of your weakness. It's a test of your strength, your judgment, and your ability to stand firm in your truth. And the power to reclaim your life, that's entirely yours. Would you have confronted a betrayal like mine, or walked away quietly? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experiences in the comments below. And if stories like this resonate with you, don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories of resilience, family drama, and the lessons life teaches us in the hardest moments. Because in the end, it's not just about the betrayal, it's about how we rise from it.
That was the first moment I realized my life was about to change, though at the time I didn't know how deep the shift would go. My husband, Mark, had been unusually quiet that morning, shuffling about in the kitchen while I brewed coffee, humming softly under his breath. The smell of cinnamon and roasted coffee beans filled the house, normal, comforting, the way it always had. I didn't notice the unease in his eyes, the way his hand lingered on the doorknob, or the small frown that flickered across his forehead like a shadow passing over sunlight. "Morning, love," he said, in his usual calm voice, but there was a hesitation I couldn't place. I set the coffee pot down, smiling, still wearing my soft, faded robe, the one Mark had teased me about because it made me look like I hadn't left the house in years. "Morning," I said, stretching my arms, feeling the warm sunlight on my kitchen floor. "You're awfully quiet today." He shrugged. "Just thinking." I didn't press. Usually, Mark's silence was harmless, but that day it lingered too long. It was around mid-morning when I heard the knock, a slow, measured knock at the front door. Mark went to answer it, and I kept my attention on the toast in the toaster, the butter melting into small pools across the golden surface. That was when I heard her voice, soft, deliberate, and achingly familiar. "Good morning, dear," my mother-in-law, Sylvia, said. Her voice had that practiced sweetness, the kind that can soothe a child, but unsettle an adult. "Mom," said Mark, a little stiff. "I thought I'd stay for a while," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Her suitcases rolled behind her with a faint rumble against the tile floor. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Stay? For a while?" I echoed, trying to keep my tone light, though my stomach had dropped. "Yes, darling," she said, smiling at me like nothing was unusual. "I thought you might like some help around the house, especially with the garden. You know, just until I get settled." Mark cleared his throat. We didn't exactly—" "It's fine," she said quickly, cutting him off. "I'll only be a few weeks." Weeks. Weeks turned into months faster than I could blink. I tried to be gracious. After all, Sylvia had always been part of Mark's life. She was charming, polite, and could make anyone feel like family at first glance. But she had a way of lingering, a way of placing herself exactly where she wanted to be, and I'd learned to notice that subtle tension in the way she moved. In the beginning, I told myself I was imagining things. I'd catch her in the kitchen, lingering near the sink while I washed dishes, humming quietly, her eyes glinting just a fraction too knowingly. She'd comment on the curtains, the way I folded the towels, the arrangement of our living room furniture, always in the form of helpful suggestions, but with a sharp undertone that felt like judgment. Mark seemed oblivious. Or worse, he was choosing to ignore it. I chalked up my unease to stress, to overthinking. We had been married for 10 years, and I trusted him implicitly. At least, I thought I did. It wasn't until one Saturday afternoon, when the light poured through the living room windows and the scent of jasmine from the garden mingled with the smell of my homemade lemon bread, that I noticed the first subtle clue. Sylvia had taken to spending long hours in the study, the one Mark and I used for bills, finances, and home planning. At first, I didn't think much of it. She was always helping. But the door was slightly ajar when I passed by, and the faint click of keys from the computer drew my attention. Curiosity overpowered caution. I stepped closer. The screen glowed. Documents opened that I had never seen before. Numbers, contracts, email threads. My pulse quickened. Something wasn't right. Mark came in behind me, and for a moment his hand brushed mine as he tried to pull me away. "It's nothing really," he said, his voice too calm, too practiced. "Nothing?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The way Sylvia's eyes danced behind the monitor, the way Mark shifted uncomfortably, it was too coordinated, too precise. Just helping her with some paperwork," he muttered, but the slight quiver betrayed him. That night I lay awake, the sheets tangled around my legs, staring at the ceiling. I replayed the day over and over. That subtle shift in Mark's tone, Sylvia's careful smile, the way the contracts had seemed so confidential. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hidden, something I wasn't supposed to see. I decided, reluctantly, to observe, to wait. I didn't want to believe my worst fears. I tried to carry on, to cook dinner, to laugh at Mark's silly jokes, to pat the dog and pretend like nothing had changed. But the tension was there, like a shadow across our home, thick and almost suffocating. It was 2 weeks later when I caught the first undeniable proof. I'd gone into the study to retrieve a document for our taxes. The chair was empty, but a folder had been left out. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside, I found property agreements, contracts, and a bank statement, all pointing to the same shocking truth. Mark and Sylvia had been planning to sell our home, without me, and divide the profits between themselves. I remember the cold rush of disbelief. The letters blurred in my hands. My chest felt tight. I sat on the floor, the folder clutched to my chest, and tried to breathe. The house, the home I had built with love and shared laughter, was being dismantled from the inside, by the people I trust most. I confronted Mark later that evening, my voice shaking but determined. "How long?" I asked, the words barely audible. He avoided my eyes. "I didn't think it would hurt you. We thought it was just practical." "Practical?" I snapped, the folder falling to the floor with a thud. "You were going to sell our home behind my back? With my own mother-in-law?" Mark sighed, ran his hair through his hair. "I didn't want to fight you. I just thought it was the best option financially." "And you thought lying was the best option emotionally?" I shot back. The conversation dissolved into silence. Sylvia hovered nearby, her expression carefully neutral, as if she had rehearsed her calm demeanor for decades. But in her eyes, I saw the faintest trace of triumph, like a cat watching a mouse skitter across the floor. That night, I sat alone in the living room, the scent of burnt toast lingering faintly from dinner, and made a decision. I wouldn't let anger or betrayal consume me. I would reclaim my dignity. I would act, not recklessly, but with precision and moral clarity. The next morning,
I woke with a heaviness I hadn't felt in years. The house was quiet, the sunlight spilling across the hardwood floors, but it no longer felt like mine. I moved through the kitchen mechanically, setting out plates and coffee, the clink of the mugs sounding sharper than usual. Mark was already there, flipping through the morning paper. Sylvia was in her usual corner, sipping tea, humming under her breath as if nothing had happened. I tried to speak casually, though my mind was already working through a plan. "Mark, we need to talk about the house," I said softly, measuring my tone. He glanced up, feigning calm. "We can discuss it later." "No, now," I said, placing my hands firmly on the table. My heart thudded in my chest. "I know what you've been doing. I found the folder, the contracts, the bank statements, all of it." Mark stiffened, his fingers tightening around the paper. Sylvia's humming stopped. She set her cup down slowly, eyes narrowing just a fraction. "It's not what it looks like," Mark said, but his voice lacked conviction. I shook my head. "It's exactly what it looks like. You and my mother-in-law plan to sell our home behind my back, divide the money, keep me in the dark." My voice rose, though I forced myself to breathe, to keep the anger from boiling over completely. Sylvia spoke then, her voice syrupy sweet, but carrying an undercurrent that made my skin crawl. "It's just a business decision, dear. You know we thought it was practical. We didn't mean to hurt you." "Practical?" I repeated, incredulous. "You have betrayed every ounce of trust I had in both of you. My home, my marriage, and you call that practical?" Mark opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. He looked at me, pleading silently for forgiveness I wasn't ready to give. That day, I walked through the house as if seeing it for the first time. I noticed the little things I had overlooked, the faint scratches on the kitchen counter, the dent in the doorframe that Mark and I had promised to fix years ago, the way Sylvia had subtly rearranged the furniture to improve traffic flow, but really to mark her territory. Every familiar corner now felt foreign, a testament to the betrayal I had uncovered. I spent the evening thinking, pacing, making lists of everything I could do. I considered confrontation, legal action, exposing the truth to friends and family. But I also wanted to preserve my dignity. I refused to become someone who stooped to petty revenge. My goal was clarity, justice, and reclaiming my life. The next week, I started quietly gathering evidence. I scanned emails between Mark and Sylvia, traced their communications, documented dates and signatures on the contracts. It was painstaking work, and each piece of evidence felt like a small victory, proof that my instincts had been right. But I couldn't ignore the emotional toll. I cried in the shower, the hot water scalding my skin as I tried to let the anger flow out. I would grip the tiles and whisper to myself, "I deserve better. I will not let them take this from me." It became a mantra. One afternoon, while Mark was at work, I called our real estate agent under the guise of checking the market. I asked subtle questions, noting the details about any pending transactions, contracts, or unusual activity. Everything confirmed my worst fears. The plan to sell the house was active, just waiting for the right moment. That evening, I sat Sylvia down in the living room. The air felt heavy, the faint aroma of her tea blending with the soft scent of my lemon candles. I spoke slowly, deliberately. "I know everything," I said, watching her carefully. "The contracts, the bank statements, the emails. I know about the plan to sell this house behind my back." Sylvia's face remained calm, but her eyes flickered, betraying a hint of panic. I didn't think." "Didn't think what?" I asked sharply. "That I would find out?
That I wouldn't notice your little scheme? Mark came home then, entering silently. He froze when he saw us sitting there, the tension palpable. Please, let's talk. No, I interrupted. You need to listen. I am not going to scream. I am not going to retaliate with cruelty, but I will not let you manipulate or betray me. This stops now. Over the next few days, I contacted a lawyer. I wasn't looking for vengeance, only protection. I needed to secure my stake in the house to prevent them from executing their plan. Every conversation, every meeting with the attorney bolstered my confidence. I realized that my sense of betrayal had a voice, and it could be wielded with intelligence and calm authority. Meanwhile, I noticed subtle changes in the household. Sylvia became quieter, moving through the rooms with less confidence. Mark avoided my gaze more often, realizing that I had uncovered the depth of their deception. The dynamic shifted, not violently, but perceptibly. The air that once felt suffocating now carried tension, a silent acknowledgement that I was no longer passive. One evening, I sat in the kitchen, sipping tea, listening to the rain tapping against the windows. I thought about the early days of our marriage, the laughter, the shared dreams, the warmth of a home we built together. I realized that betrayal didn't erase those memories, but it demanded action. I would reclaim not just the house, but the integrity of my life. The confrontation came quietly. I presented the evidence to both Mark and Sylvia, laid out my demands, and made it clear that I would not be manipulated. I didn't shout, I didn't plead, I simply stood firm. And for the first time in weeks, I saw true fear in their eyes. They realized that their scheme could not succeed, not with me fully awake to it. In the following days, negotiations were tense but measured, legal agreements were redrawn, and the house was officially mine. Sylvia moved out shortly thereafter, claiming family obligations elsewhere, her pride intact, but her control diminished. Mark and I were left alone to confront the fractures in our marriage, the lies, the silences that had crept between us. It was not easy. The rebuilding required conversations that were uncomfortable, therapy sessions that dredged up old wounds, and a willingness to confront my own role in ignoring early warning signs. But slowly, piece by piece, trust began to return. I realized that betrayal, while devastating, could also be a catalyst for growth, for clarity, for reclaiming the boundaries that define one's life.
The days that followed felt like walking on glass. Every step in my own home reminded me of the betrayal, yet each step also felt like reclaiming territory that had been quietly threatened. I started paying attention to the smallest details, the creak of the floorboards, the way sunlight caught the edges of the coffee table, the faint smell of jasmine from the garden that Sylvia had loved to manipulate. It was my home again, but it required vigilance and patience. Mark tried to talk, of course. He would linger near the doorway, his hands fumbling with something, a mug, a newspaper, as if trying to gauge my mood. "I'm sorry," he would say, in his calm, measured voice, but the apology felt thin, rehearsed. I knew he was scared, not just of me, but of the consequences that were finally catching up to him. One evening, I decided to test the waters. I asked him, quietly, "Why did you do it?" He stared at me, the weight of guilt pressing down on him like a physical thing. I thought it was the only way to make things work. Mom said we could make a lot of money. I didn't think you'd find out. I sat down slowly, folding my hands in my lap. Didn't think I'd find out? Mark, we've been married for 10 years. I trusted you with everything. My heart, my life, our home. And you made a secret deal with your mother behind my back? He swallowed hard. I was scared.
I didn't want to fight you. I didn't want the conflict. But you created the biggest conflict of all, I said softly, but with an edge. You betrayed me. And for what? Money? Convenience? Your mother's approval? Mark didn't answer. The silence in the room was thick, almost suffocating, and I realized something crucial. He had underestimated me. He had assumed that I would stay silent, that I would forgive blindly, that I would continue to play the role of the obedient wife. But I had discovered my own strength in the midst of betrayal. Over the next week, I took small but deliberate actions to regain control. I contacted our financial institutions, confirmed ownership and rights, and ensured that no transaction could proceed without my consent. Every phone call, every signature was a step toward reclaiming the security and stability that had been threatened. Sylvia, meanwhile, began to distance herself. I noticed the subtle changes, the way she lingered less in the kitchen, the absence of her humming as she moved through the rooms, the polite but strained hello when she passed me in the hallway. She had miscalculated. Her presence had been a strategy, a way to assert control over my life. But I refused to be manipulated. One afternoon, I invited a close friend over. Maria had known the family for years, and her insight had always been invaluable. I told her everything, the contracts, the emails, the deception. She listened quietly, nodding, and then looked at me with an intensity that made me feel seen. "You did the right thing," she said firmly, "not out of anger, but out of self-respect. That's what matters." Her words settled in my chest like a warm weight. I realized that this wasn't just about the house. It wasn't just about the money or the betrayal. It was about boundaries, dignity, and the refusal to let manipulation define my life. As the weeks passed, the tension in the house gradually lifted. Mark still struggled with guilt, and I still carried the sting of betrayal, but the atmosphere became one of quiet recalibration. I focused on small rituals that grounded me, cooking meals, tending to the garden, reading in the sunlight that streamed through the windows. These small acts were reminders that I was reclaiming not just the house, but my peace of mind. Then came the turning point. I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping tea and reviewing some old family photos when Mark approached cautiously. He sat across from me, his hands folded, his gaze earnest. "I want to make things right," he said simply. "Not just with the house, but with us. I know I've broken your trust. I know it won't be easy to rebuild, but I'm willing to try if you are." I studied his face carefully. I could see the sincerity, but also the fragility. I knew forgiveness wouldn't be instantaneous, and trust wouldn't return overnight, but I also recognized the opportunity for healing. "I'm willing to rebuild," I said slowly, "but it has to be honest this time. No secrets, no deals behind my back. We start from truth." He nodded, relief evident in his posture. It was a small step, but an important one. In that moment, I realized something essential. Betrayal doesn't have to be the end. It can be a catalyst for reflection, for boundaries, for reclaiming power in a way that is both dignified and measured. In the following months, our marriage began a slow, careful process of repair. We attended counseling together, talking through the layers of deception, the fears, and the unspoken resentments that had built up over the years. Each conversation was painstaking, but necessary. Each act of transparency, each moment of accountability reinforced a new foundation, one built not on blind trust, but on mutual respect and honesty. I also took steps to redefine my relationship with Sylvia. We remained cordial, but the dynamic had changed. She no longer wielded influence in my home. Her presence was limited to formal visits, and the tension that once shadowed every corner of the house dissipated. I discovered that reclaiming power didn't require animosity. It required clarity, boundaries, and the courage to act with integrity. Through this ordeal, I learned an unexpected lesson. Betrayal, though painful, reveals the contours of one's own strength. It forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths, but it also illuminates the path to self-respect and dignity. I realized that my worth wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval or deception. It was inherent, and it had to be protected. Looking back, I can see the moments that led to this awakening. The quiet morning when I first sensed the tension, the folder of contracts that confirmed my suspicions, the conversations that tested my resolve. Each moment was a step toward reclaiming myself. And in reclaiming myself, I reclaimed not just my home, but the authority over my life and my choices.
By the time Sylvia finally moved out, the house felt different. Not in a bad way, not at all, but like a space that had been tested and purified. A home that had withstood a storm. I spent that first morning alone in the living room, sunlight streaming through the windows, the faint scent of the garden carried inside by the open windows. I sipped my tea slowly, listening to the ticking clock, feeling the rhythm of my own heartbeat. It was quiet, peaceful, mine again. I started small projects to reclaim the space, painting the hallway a warmer shade, planting new flowers in the garden, rearranging furniture in ways that felt intentional, personal, and free from the shadow of someone else's control. Each little act was a subtle declaration. This is my home, my life, my boundaries. Mark watched from the sidelines, hesitant at first, like a man treading on fragile ice. But slowly he began participating, helping with gardening, fixing broken shelves, sitting with me in the evenings to talk about our day. I could sense his remorse, but also a willingness to contribute to rebuilding trust. There were no dramatic declarations, no grand gestures, just quiet, consistent actions that spoke louder than words ever could. One evening, after a long day of gardening and organizing, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat by the window, the soft glow of the sunset painting the walls in orange and gold. Mark joined me, leaning against the frame of the open window. He didn't say much, just offered a gentle smile, one that carried both apology and hope. "He still can't believe how blind I was," he murmured. "I didn't realize how much damage we caused. I'm sorry for everything." I took a deep breath, letting the words settle into my chest. I said, "I know. It hurt, more than I can put into words. But we can't undo the past. We can only decide what comes next." There was a pause, the kind that stretches, but doesn't feel empty. A space for reflection, for acknowledgement. "I want to do better," he said finally. "I want us to do better." I nodded. "Then we start from here. Honesty first, boundary second, everything else will follow." It wasn't an overnight transformation. There were moments of tension, lingering mistrust, and quiet resentment. But over time, those moments became fewer. Our conversations grew more open, our laughter more genuine. I realized that rebuilding trust wasn't about forgetting the betrayal. It was about creating a new pattern, one in which honesty and respect were non-negotiable. I also began reflecting on my relationship with Sylvia. For years, I had tolerated subtle manipulations, her insistence on control, the way she quietly undermined me. Confronting the betrayal had forced me to recognize her motivations: fear of losing influence over her son, a desire for control, and a misguided belief that she could manage my life better than I could. Understanding that didn't excuse her behavior, but it allowed me to release the lingering anger in a way that didn't consume me. We established boundaries, clear, firm, non-negotiable. Visits were limited to family events, no unannounced drop-ins, no interference with finances or household decisions. Sylvia accepted it quietly, perhaps realizing that her old tactics no longer worked. And with that acceptance came a sense of relief.
I could finally breathe in my own home again, free from the shadow that had once hung over it. The experience changed me in ways I hadn't expected. I became more attuned to subtle cues, more assertive in my communication, and more protective of my own space and dignity. I realized that betrayal is not just about others' actions. It's about how you respond, how you reclaim your agency, and how you set the tone for your own life. Mark and I also began working on our long-term goals together, openly discussing finances, career plans, and future investments. I felt a renewed sense of partnership, not one based on blind trust, but on mutual accountability and respect. And slowly, the warmth returned to our home. Meals were shared without tension, conversations flowed without hesitation, and even the small, everyday gestures, holding hands while walking through the garden, laughing over a shared joke, making tea together, carried a deeper significance than they ever had before. One afternoon, I found myself sitting on the porch, a notebook in my lap, jotting down thoughts and reflections. The sun was low in the sky, and the breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers from the garden. I wrote about betrayal, yes, but also about resilience, dignity, and the power of measured action. I wrote about the importance of boundaries, of speaking up, and of reclaiming control when it feels like life has been hijacked by others. It struck me then that the real lesson wasn't about Mark or Sylvia. It was about me, about recognizing my worth, trusting my instincts, and acting with both courage and grace. Betrayal had been a harsh teacher, but it had also been transformative. I had learned that dignity and self-respect are non-negotiable, that patience and planning can outmaneuver deceit, and that reclaiming your life is always possible, even after someone tries to take it from you. By the time the first anniversary of Sylvia's departure arrived, our home felt wholly ours again. I looked around at the familiar walls, the garden blooming under the spring sun, the photos of our family lining the shelves, and I felt a quiet pride. I had endured, I had observed, I had acted, and I had reclaimed not just my home, but the authority and peace of mind that came with it. I realized something else too. Life isn't always about dramatic gestures or explosive confrontations. Sometimes it's about quiet persistence, deliberate action, and unwavering adherence to your own values. Sometimes reclaiming your power is a matter of small, consistent steps rather than dramatic vengeance. And sometimes the calm after the storm, the peace of knowing you've protected what is yours, morally and emotionally, is the most satisfying victory of all.
With the house secure and the immediate tension between Mark, Sylvia, and me eased, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. But the cracks left by betrayal were not invisible, and I realized that rebuilding trust required more than just practical steps. It required emotional work, patience, and reflection. I began keeping a journal, a quiet place where I could process my thoughts without judgment. Each entry was a confession, a small acknowledgement of pain, fear, and anger, but also of strength, clarity, and hope. I wrote about the mornings I felt my stomach tighten when I saw Sylvia's empty chair, about the nights I lay awake imagining the house being sold without my consent. But I also wrote about the mornings when Mark quietly fixed the leaky faucet without being asked, the evenings when we shared laughter over dinner, the small victories that reminded me that life could still hold warmth. Mark and I committed to weekly check-ins. Every Sunday evening, we would sit at the kitchen table, cups of tea in hand, and talk openly. I listened to his regrets, the confusion he felt about his own choices, and the realization that he had jeopardized everything we had built. He listened to me, my feelings of betrayal, my fears, and my insistence that honesty and transparency would no longer be negotiable. These conversations were raw, sometimes painful, but each one chipped away at the wall of silence that had grown between us. I also invested time in my personal space and passions.
I enrolled in a pottery class at a local community center, something I had always wanted to try but never prioritized. The tactile nature of clay, the slow shaping of something beautiful from a formless lump, mirrored the reconstruction I was doing in my own life. It was therapeutic, grounding, and oddly empowering. I felt a sense of agency return to my fingertips, a tangible reminder that I could create, mold, and rebuild, both in clay and in life. Family gatherings became opportunities for careful observation and measured responses. Sylvia occasionally attended events, but her influence was curtailed. I noticed how people looked at me differently now, not just as Mark's wife, but as a woman who had faced deception with dignity and reclaimed her authority. Some whispered, others offered cautious smiles, but I welcomed the subtle acknowledgement that my presence could no longer be undermined. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by, remarking on the changes in our garden. "It feels peaceful here again," she said. I smiled, realizing she had captured the essence of what I had been working toward. It wasn't just the house that had been restored, it was the emotional atmosphere, the sense of security and warmth that had been stolen for a time, but had been returned through deliberate effort. Evenings became a time for reflection and planning, not just for Mark and me, but for myself. I thought about the lessons I had learned, the importance of trusting my instincts, the necessity of setting boundaries, and the power of deliberate, thoughtful action over impulsive retaliation. Betrayal had forced me to confront difficult truths, but it had also shown me the strength I carried, the clarity I could achieve when I refused to be passive. There were moments, of course, when memories of the betrayal surged unexpectedly. A glance at the empty chair where Sylvia once lingered, an email mistakenly addressed to me but meant for her, a casual remark from Mark that echoed the old dynamic. In those moments, I reminded myself of the progress we had made, of the deliberate steps I had taken, and of the control I now held over my life and my home. The culmination of this journey came subtly, without fanfare. One morning, I walked through the living room, noticing the sunlight catching the edges of the furniture, the faint scent of jasmine mingling with my own candles, the quiet hum of the house as it settled into routine. I realized fully that I felt safe, centered, and whole in a way I hadn't in months. The house was mine again, yes, but more importantly, my sense of self and my authority over my life had been restored. Mark approached carrying 2 mugs of tea and offered me a small, genuine smile. "You've done so much," he said quietly. "I can only hope to match your strength." I accepted the tea, feeling the warmth seep into my hands, the liquid calming the last remnants of lingering tension. "We've both learned," I said softly, "but remember, I had to fight for it. I had to reclaim what was mine." He nodded, and for the first time, there was no shadow between us, only the quiet understanding that the house, the marriage, and the trust would have to be nurtured from here on out. The journey wasn't over, but the foundation had been laid. I spent the evening in my favorite chair by the window, notebook in hand, reflecting on the months of upheaval. Betrayal had entered our lives like a storm, violent and unrelenting. But storms pass, and they leave behind lessons, clarity, and sometimes the opportunity for growth that would have been unimaginable in calm weather. I thought about my own strength, about the choices I had made, about the courage it took to confront deception calmly yet decisively. I realized that dignity, integrity, and persistence were more powerful than anger, resentment, or revenge. The house, the garden, and even the sunlight seemed to affirm this quiet truth. Reclaiming one's life is not about striking back, but about standing firm, speaking the truth, and refusing to be diminished by the actions of others.
In the weeks that followed, I noticed subtle shifts, not just in the home, but in myself. The air felt lighter, as if the house itself had exhaled. I began to appreciate the ordinary moments that once seemed mundane. The hum of the refrigerator, the sound of rain tapping against the window, the way sunlight slanted across the floor in the late afternoon. These small things, which I had taken for granted, now carried a weight of serenity and ownership. Mark and I continued to rebuild cautiously. We reinstated weekly check-ins, honest conversations where neither of us held back. He admitted, more openly each time, the fear and weakness that had led him to collude with Sylvia. He confessed how much he had underestimated the consequences of secrecy and deception. I, in turn, voiced my ongoing frustrations, the anxiety that lingered, and the deep need for transparency moving forward. It was during one of these conversations that a new understanding emerged. "I realize now," Mark said quietly, "that trying to protect us by hiding the truth only hurt us more. I thought I was being practical, but all I did was break the trust we spent years building." I nodded, feeling a weight lift from my chest. "Practicality without honesty is just deception. I won't forget what happened, Mark, but I do see that you're trying. That matters." The garden became my sanctuary during this period of reflection. I started planting new flowers, roses, lavender, daisies, each bloom a small symbol of reclamation and resilience. I would spend hours tending to them, hands in the soil, mind untangling the knots of betrayal and hurt. There was something grounding in the act of nurturing life, of witnessing growth in something tangible. With each bloom, I felt a quiet affirmation. I could grow, even after being wounded. Our family dynamics also shifted. Sylvia began attending family events less frequently, and when she did, I maintained polite but firm boundaries. I learned the power of quiet control, the ability to manage her influence not with confrontation, but with calm assertiveness. She had no illusions about manipulating me anymore, and the subtle power dynamic had completely reversed. I found peace in knowing I had claimed my space without stooping to pettiness. One afternoon, I received a call from my sister-in-law, Rachel. She had been unaware of the scheme and was shocked by the details I shared. She said, "I can't believe she did that. And Mark, I'm so sorry you went through this." "I appreciate that," I replied, "but I've learned that betrayal doesn't define me. How I respond to it does. And I'm choosing to respond with clarity and dignity, not anger." It struck me in that moment how much perspective mattered. I could have raged, sought revenge, or acted impulsively, but instead, I had chosen observation, evidence, and deliberate action. That choice didn't erase the betrayal, but it ensured that I was the one in control of the outcome. As the months went by, Mark and I began to experience moments of genuine intimacy and connection again. Nothing was rushed or forced. Trust had to be rebuilt carefully, like a fragile vase glued back together. But the cracks didn't diminish the beauty. They reminded us both of the lessons learned and the care required to maintain something precious. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold, I realized how much I had changed. I had been shaken to my core by the betrayal, but the experience had unveiled a strength I hadn't fully recognized in myself. I could navigate deception, set boundaries, and reclaim my life without sacrificing dignity. I also understood that healing wasn't linear. There were setbacks, moments when old insecurities crept back, when I doubted my decisions, or when a memory of betrayal stirred anger. But each time I returned to the same principles: observation, deliberate action, and self-respect. And each time I felt a little stronger, a little more in control of my own narrative. Mark noticed the change too. He began to treat me with a renewed respect, not out of fear or guilt, but because he recognized the clarity and strength I had cultivated. He became more attentive, communicative, and present. I began to see him as a partner, not just a spouse, someone who could learn, grow, and actively contribute to rebuilding what had been damaged. Then, one quiet evening, I found myself reflecting on the lessons in a journal. I wrote about betrayal and its power to illuminate hidden truths. I wrote about the importance of boundaries, the value of observation, and the strength that comes from measured, thoughtful action. I wrote about dignity, the kind that doesn't demand vengeance, but asserts itself with quiet authority. I realized the ultimate lesson wasn't about the house, or even about Sylvia or Mark. It was about me, about my resilience, my judgment, and my willingness to act decisively when trust was violated. The betrayal had been a harsh teacher, but it had given me clarity, wisdom, and a renewed sense of purpose. By the time the house felt truly restored, it wasn't just a home, it was a symbol of boundaries respected, of strength reclaimed, and of the quiet power that comes from acting with integrity rather than impulse. Every corner of the house, every blooming flower in the garden, every sunbeam streaming through the windows reminded me that I had endured, learned, and reclaimed my life. And I knew, deep in my heart, that the peace I felt wasn't temporary. It wasn't fragile. It was the result of deliberate choices, thoughtful action, and an unwavering commitment to my own dignity.
Spring arrived in full bloom, and with it, a sense of calm that had seemed impossible months earlier. The house felt alive again, filled with sunlight, warmth, and laughter. The betrayal that had once cast a shadow over every corner now felt like a distant memory, not forgotten, but transformed into a source of strength and wisdom. I spent mornings in the garden, tending to the flowers I had planted during the long months of uncertainty. The roses had grown strong, their stems upright and blossoms vibrant, and I couldn't help but smile. There was a metaphor in that, resilience and beauty nurtured even after harsh weather. I understood, finally, that life didn't end with betrayal. It could bloom again, brighter and stronger. Mark had changed too. He no longer carried the smug ease that had allowed secrecy to flourish. He moved through the house with a quiet attentiveness, checking in with me, listening with genuine focus. He asked questions about decisions, sought my opinion on matters big and small, and even admitted when he wasn't sure. That vulnerability, once absent, became a bridge toward rebuilding trust. One evening after dinner, we sat together in the living room. The soft glow of the lamp cast long shadows across the walls, and the hum of the evening cicadas filled the silence. Mark reached for my hand and said quietly, "I've spent so long trying to avoid conflict, trying to take shortcuts. I see now that honesty and patience are the only way forward. Thank you for showing me that." I squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of our journey in that simple touch. It wasn't easy, and it's still a process, but the fact that we're here, facing it together, makes the difference. We've learned something few couples do, that betrayal doesn't have to end a relationship if you act with integrity and insist on respect. I also began to reflect on Sylvia. Though she remained a presence in our lives, it was now a controlled one. Our relationship had shifted from one of tension and manipulation to polite acknowledgement. I understood her motives: control, fear of losing her influence, a misguided sense of practicality, but I didn't allow her actions to dictate my emotional state anymore. That distance, both physical and psychological, became essential for my continued peace. In the months that followed, I noticed subtle changes within myself. I was more decisive, more attuned to the nuances of behavior, and more protective of my emotional and physical space. I had learned to trust my instincts and recognize the signs of manipulation early. I became a more present partner, friend, and mother, not because I had to compensate for betrayal, but because I had gained clarity and confidence in my own judgment. One Saturday afternoon, Mark and I hosted a small gathering of friends. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the easy conversation felt like a testament to how far we had come. At one point, I stepped into the kitchen to refresh drinks, catching my reflection in the window.
I saw a woman who had endured deception, confronted it calmly, and emerged with dignity intact. I felt a swell of pride. Later that evening, after the guests had left, I sat by the window with a notebook in my lap. The house was quiet, bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. I wrote about the journey we had endured, the betrayal, the evidence, the confrontation, and the deliberate steps taken to reclaim control. I reflected on the lessons learned. Trust your instincts, even when it feels uncomfortable. Observe quietly before acting, so your decisions are measured, not reactive. Maintain dignity and integrity. Revenge rarely provides true peace. Boundaries are essential, even with those you love. Healing is possible, but it requires time, patience, and deliberate action. I closed the notebook and set it on the table. I realized that peace was not simply the absence of betrayal, but the presence of self-respect, clarity, and calm authority over my life. I felt that calm deeply, as if it had seeped into every corner of the house and into every aspect of myself. Mark joined me quietly, leaning against the window frame. "You've taught me more than I could have imagined," he said softly. "Not just about honesty or trust, but about strength and grace. I'm grateful." I smiled, letting the words settle. I said, "We've both learned, but the important thing is that we've chosen a better way forward, one that honors both of us and doesn't allow deception to take root again." That night, I went to bed with a sense of closure I hadn't expected. The betrayal, once raw and painful, now felt like a turning point, a crucible through which I had passed, emerging stronger, wiser, and more attuned to my own worth. I slept deeply, the soft hum of the night carrying with it the assurance that I had reclaimed my home, my life, and my dignity. In the weeks that followed, I continued to nurture not only the house, but my own sense of self. I spent time journaling, practicing mindfulness, and reconnecting with friends and family who supported my journey. I realized that betrayal, while devastating, can also serve as a catalyst for transformation. It forces reflection, clarity, and the assertion of boundaries that might have been neglected in the comfort of routine. I also reflected on forgiveness. I didn't need to forgive immediately, nor did I need to forget, but I could release the grip of resentment, understanding that forgiveness was less about absolving the betrayer and more about freeing myself from the constant weight of anger. In letting go, I allowed myself to move forward without bitterness, with a sense of moral and emotional equilibrium intact. Mark and I began discussing long-term plans again, home renovations, travel, even future investments. But this time, the conversations were grounded in transparency, shared goals, and mutual respect. Every decision was made together, and every agreement required openness and honesty. The foundation had shifted from convenience and secrecy to integrity and collaboration. One late afternoon, as I sat in the garden surrounded by blooming flowers, I took a deep breath of the fresh air and felt a profound sense of calm. The house, the garden, and even the memories of betrayal had become a testament to resilience. I had reclaimed control, not with anger or retribution, but with patience, observation, and moral clarity. And in that moment, I realized the ultimate truth. Life can be unpredictable. People can betray, but dignity, integrity, and deliberate action are the tools that allow us to reclaim our power. The house was mine again, but more importantly, so was I.